It began on a night so ordinary that no one in Haven Ridge, Michigan, could have imagined it would one day be remembered in documentaries and courtrooms. The winter of 2010 was brutal across the state, the kind of cold that cracked glass and silenced the woods for miles. Most families were inside their homes that evening, windows fogged with warmth, the faint glow of televisions flickering behind drawn curtains. In a town of just over 7,000, where people trusted unlocked doors and familiar faces, nothing ever seemed out of place. But on Birchwood Drive, in a small blue house tucked behind an oak that had long lost its leaves, something happened that would fracture that quiet illusion forever. Laura Brenner, a 38-year-old nurse at Mercy West Hospital, was supposed to start her night shift at 10 p.m. She had never missed one in 12 years of work. Around 9:30, her car was seen idling in the driveway, headlights carving pale arcs through the falling snow. When the clock struck 10, and she still hadn't arrived at the hospital, her supervisor assumed she'd been delayed by the icy roads. By midnight, when her phone went straight to voicemail and her teenage son Jacob failed to answer his, unease began to seep in like the cold itself. At 1:12 a.m., the local dispatcher received a call from Laura's co-worker, her voice trembling, reporting that Laura and her son were missing. It was the kind of call that starts quietly, almost routine, until it becomes the center of a story no one can walk away from. When officers arrived, the scene was deceptively calm. The Brenner's golden retriever barked weakly from inside, tail tucked, as if sensing what people could not yet see. The front door was unlocked, the living room light still on, a mug of coffee half finished on the counter, and the television playing a muted rerun. In the driveway, Laura's sedan continued to hum, exhaust curling in ghostly ribbons through the snow. The only disturbance lay in the back entryway, where the frame around the glass door was splintered, a small trail of melted snow leading inward, and one fingerprint pressed faintly into the chipped paint. It was partial, smudged by moisture, barely worth collecting, but it would outlast everyone's guesses and become the key to unraveling the mystery 15 years later. At first glance, nothing about the Brenners suggested danger. Laura was known as the kind neighbor who shoveled elderly driveways and left baskets of muffins on porches. Jacob was quiet, gentle, the kind of boy who spent hours building model cars in his room. Their life was small, honest, and completely unremarkable, until that single winter night turned their home into a scene frozen in time. Detectives canvassed the street by morning, their footprints the only new marks on the untouched snow. Every neighbor claimed to have heard nothing except the wind. Everyone, except one man, who would remain in plain sight for the next decade. As the first rays of dawn stretched over the frozen roofs, Sergeant Mark Ellison looked over the house and whispered to his partner that something about it didn't feel random. He noted the engine still running, the dog's fear, the way 2 mugs were set on the table, as if Laura had been expecting company. He had worked homicide before, but this one sat differently, quiet and deliberate. In his report, he wrote a single line beneath the routine checklist. "If this is an accident, I'll eat my batch." It was a private thought, not meant for any report or headline, but it would echo across the years like a prophecy fulfilled. That morning, Haven Ridge woke to flashing lights and police tape cutting across a street that had never seen either. Reporters from nearby counties arrived by afternoon, their camera tripods sinking into the snow, their microphones catching the hum of the idling car still being processed for evidence. The town, once defined by its predictability, was about to become the setting of Michigan's most haunting mystery. Behind the sealed door of the Brenner house, investigators would dust that small, imperfect fingerprint again and again, hoping for a match that never came. They would bag the coffee mugs, measure the shoe prints by the back porch, and photograph the shards of wood where someone had forced their way in. Yet every clue led to silence. And in that silence, a question began to grow. Not who could have entered, but how someone could disappear so completely, leaving behind only warmth, light, and a car that refused to stop running. 15 years later, that car, that house, and that faint fingerprint would resurface in an investigation that proved no one truly knows the people who live next door. But on that winter night in 2010, as the snow kept falling and the engine finally sputtered out, Haven Ridge didn't yet know it was living through the first hours of a story that would take more than a decade to tell. Haven Ridge was the kind of town that never made the news unless it was for a county fair or a high school football championship. It sat quietly between frozen lakes and endless farmland, an hour outside Grand Rapids, where snowdrifts piled like walls along narrow streets and time seemed to move just a little slower. In winter, the air smelled of pine and diesel from snowplows rumbling before dawn. Rows of identical houses with low roofs and mailboxes dusted in frost formed a pattern so ordinary it was comforting. People here took pride in small things: clean sidewalks, folded flags, a church service that started exactly at 9. Every Friday, the same faces gathered at the diner on Main Street, where the waitress, who had worked there for 30 years, poured coffee as if the world beyond Haven Ridge did not exist. It was a place where names mattered, reputations lasted decades, and everyone thought they understood everyone else. But the disappearance of Laura and Jacob Brenner in February 2010 broke that quiet illusion of safety like thin ice. The news spread in whispers at first: an unexplained absence, a missing nurse, a car left idling in the snow. By morning, every porch light on Birchwood Drive glowed like a silent vigil. The Brenners weren't outsiders. They were part of the fabric of Haven Ridge, woven into its routines and neighborly kindness. Laura had treated half the town's elderly population at the hospital. She had volunteered for blood drives, delivered soup during flu season, and offered free babysitting when neighbors' schedules collapsed. Her absence felt like an insult to the town's self-image, as though kindness itself had been violated. For many, the question wasn't simply what had happened, but how something so brutal could happen here. When local reporters arrived, they found a community caught between denial and fear. At the Shell station near the highway, 2 men argued about whether it had to be an outsider. "No one from here would do something like that," one insisted, shaking his head. Others weren't so sure. A few remembered seeing unfamiliar tire tracks near the Brenners' driveway that night, and one woman swore she saw a man walking near the frozen pond after midnight, though she couldn't describe his face. Rumors grew as fast as the frost on window panes. Some said Laura had a secret boyfriend. Others whispered about a runaway attempt or debts nobody knew about. The police released no new information, fueling the vacuum where speculation thrived. Through that winter, the town's rhythm changed. Parents locked their doors earlier, dogs were brought inside, and people began installing motion lights on porches that had never needed them before. The postman, who once lingered to chat, started moving faster, avoiding eye contact. Even the local pastor devoted a Sunday sermon to trust lost and the search for light. Haven Ridge wasn't used to fear. It was used to routine, and now even the sound of a late-night car door could make curtains twitch. The investigation base was set up in the town library's basement, between shelves of old civic records and yellowing newspapers. Detectives from Grand Rapids joined the local police, bringing laptops and forensic kits that looked out of place against the musty carpet and fluorescent lights. The residents watched them come and go, their black jackets a daily reminder that the story wasn't over. Reporters camped outside, filming snow falling over the Brenner home, the police tape fluttering in the wind, the house itself becoming a frozen monument to absence. At night, teenagers dared each other to walk up to the front door, to look through the frosted windows, and claim they heard voices inside. Every small town has its myths, and in Haven Ridge, that house became the center of one. But beneath the curiosity lay guilt. The people of Birchwood Drive could not shake the thought that they might have seen or heard something and dismissed it. One neighbor, a widowed man who lived 2 houses down, recalled hearing what sounded like a muffled argument that night, but had assumed it was television. Another thought she saw a flashlight flicker in the backyard, but her husband told her she was imagining things. In small towns, people believe in proximity as safety, that knowing your neighbor is protection enough. The Brenners' disappearance shattered that faith. Haven Ridge began to realize that knowing someone's first name or sharing coffee with them doesn't mean you know who they are when the lights go out. As weeks turned into months, the case lingered in conversation the way cold lingers in bone. Memorials appeared at the edge of Birchwood Drive, stuffed animals, framed photos, candles that melted into the snow. Local children learned to say the Brenner name in hushed tones, as if invoking it might disturb the peace. Laura's sister, Denise, drove from Muskegon every month to stand in front of the sealed house, pressing her gloved hand to the door as though she could reach through the silence. She refused to move on, even when others tried to. "You don't move on," she told a local reporter. "You wait. You wait until something gives." By summer, the town had grown weary of waiting. The news crews packed up, the search parties dwindled, and Haven Ridge's headlines returned to school board meetings and seasonal festivals. But the air was never quite the same. People spoke more softly at the diner. Strangers received wary glances instead of friendly nods. The phrase, "Things like that don't happen here," quietly disappeared from local vocabulary, replaced by a lingering question no one dared ask aloud. If it could happen once, could it happen again? For a place built on the illusion of safety, Haven Ridge had been forced to confront something larger than one crime. It had seen how fragile that illusion truly was. And while most of its residents eventually went back to work, to Sunday service, to trimming hedges and waving across lawns, the memory of that night hung over the town like low winter clouds that refused to clear. The Brenner case had become more than an unsolved disappearance. It had become a story the town told itself to explain its own unease, a story that would stretch through years of silence until the day one old fingerprint finally spoke louder than all their doubts combined. Before Laura Brenner's name became synonymous with tragedy, she was known simply as Laura from Birchwood Drive. The nurse who worked the late shift, the neighbor who remembered birthdays, the woman who always smiled even when she was running late. People in Haven Ridge liked to say she had one of those faces that seemed to know how to listen. Her laugh, soft but certain, was often heard from her porch in summer evenings when she watered the hanging baskets and spoke to neighbors across the fence. She had lived in that house for 8 years, raising her son Jacob almost entirely on her own after her brief marriage to a man who left when Jacob was 4. She never spoke ill of him. When people asked, she'd just shrug and say that life is quieter when you stop trying to fix people who don't want to be fixed. That quietness for her wasn't loneliness. It was survival. Her days followed a rhythm that everyone on Birchwood Drive could recognize. She'd leave for work around 9:45 every evening, headlights sweeping across the driveways like a routine signal that all was right with the world. Jacob, a shy 15-year-old who wore hoodies too large for him and spent hours coding small games on an old desktop computer, would be at the window watching her car disappear. He was bright in an understated way, a boy who didn't seek attention but noticed everything. Teachers described him as patient, polite, and endlessly curious, especially about machines and electricity. His science teacher recalled that he once dismantled a broken lamp just to see how light was trapped inside. That curiosity had no outlet in a small town where the world felt limited, and Laura knew it. She often told friends that Jacob would be the one to leave Haven Ridge behind someday, maybe to study engineering, maybe to build something that would carry him far away from the frozen lakes and endless winters. Inside their modest house, there was warmth in every corner. The living room smelled faintly of cinnamon candles. The walls painted a soft yellow that caught the afternoon sun. On the refrigerator, notes in Laura's tidy handwriting reminded Jacob to take out the trash or feed the dog. But next to them were small affirmations written for him. You can do hard things. Be kind, even when it's difficult. There was a calm strength about her, a steady energy that seemed to balance the chaos of emergency rooms and long night shifts. She worked in trauma care, yet at home, she created peace, a small refuge from the harshness she saw daily. Her colleagues described her as meticulous, the kind of nurse who stayed an extra hour to sit with patients who had no visitors. She believed every person deserved to be seen, one co-worker said years later. Even when she was exhausted, she had that light. The Brenners' life wasn't extravagant, but it was content. Weekends meant pancakes, thrift store finds, and spontaneous drives to the lake shore when the weather allowed. The only luxury Laura allowed herself was a second-hand upright piano she'd bought for $50 from a church auction. It sat by the front window, its keys slightly uneven, and on rare, quiet nights, she'd play old songs from the radio, her fingers slow but sure. Sometimes Jacob would sit nearby, building models, while she hummed softly, the sound blending with the rhythmic tick of the wall clock. They didn't talk much during those moments. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full of understanding. Neighbors remembered seeing her and Jacob decorating their porch with white lights every winter, long after Christmas had passed. She said the lights made the house feel safe, one neighbor told police later. It became a small ritual, a symbol of endurance through the heavy Michigan winters. That February night in 2010, the same light still glowed faintly through the snowfall, blinking in the dark like fragile beacons of reassurance. No one knew that inside the house, the very calm that had defined their lives was unraveling. In retrospect, there had been subtle changes, moments too small to recognize as warnings. Laura had seemed distracted at work in the weeks before the disappearance. A colleague noticed her checking the clock more often, frowning at text messages she never explained. A neighbor recalled seeing a man talking to her by the driveway one afternoon, his posture tense, her arms folded tightly across her chest. When asked later, the neighbor said he assumed it was someone asking for directions, but the image stuck in his mind because Laura had looked uncomfortable, not fearful exactly, but wary. In a place where everyone knew everyone, even a hint of tension stood out. At home, Jacob had also seemed quieter in his final weeks. His English teacher remembered that he'd written an essay titled "Things That Don't Make Sense," a list of moments he wished adults would explain. The essay included lines like, "Sometimes people are nice only when they want something," and "You can tell when your mom is pretending not to worry." It was the kind of writing that, at the time, seemed like a teenager's introspection, but in hindsight read like a quiet warning from someone who had noticed too much. His best friend told police that Jacob had mentioned hearing arguments through the walls, not shouting, but the kind where voices get small and serious. The friend didn't press for details. In small towns, curiosity is sometimes confused with betrayal, and people learn early to stay silent about what doesn't concern them. Laura's sister Denise would later recall one phone call in late January 2010. Laura had sounded tired, but upbeat, talking about a home repair she couldn't afford to finish. When Denise offered to help, Laura refused, saying a neighbor had offered to fix it for a small fee. She didn't name the neighbor, and Denise hadn't asked. At the time, it sounded like one of those harmless exchanges that happen in close-knit communities where favors are traded and forgotten. Only years later, when investigators reopened the case, would that passing detail gain a chilling clarity. What no one realized, that winter, was that the Brenners' predictable, peaceful life had been slowly intersecting with something darker. The same routines that made them seem safe, Laura's late shifts, Jacob's quiet evenings, their unlocked back door, had made them visible to someone watching. The house that always glowed with gentle light had become a map, its rhythms memorized by a man who lived only a few houses away. While the town saw kindness, he saw vulnerability. While Laura saw community, he saw opportunity. And in that ordinary February night, all the warmth she had built, all the small rituals of love and safety, would become the very backdrop of a crime that seemed impossible in a place like Haven Ridge. Years later, when detectives reconstructed those final weeks, they would come to believe that the tragedy didn't begin with violence, but with familiarity, with trust misplaced in a neighbor's smile, in the kind of closeness that small towns nurture without question. For Laura and Jacob Brenner, the walls of their home, painted in gentle yellow, would not protect them from what was coming. And for Haven Ridge, the revelation that safety can be an illusion would take years to fully understand. The night of February 6th, 2010, began like so many others in the Brenner household. Quiet, predictable, a domestic rhythm unfolding against the hum of the furnace and the whisper of snow against the windows. Laura had just finished her shift at Mercy West and returned home earlier than usual, a rare Saturday evening without emergencies to keep her late. The air outside was sharp, and her car tires crackled over the thin ice on Birchwood Drive. Inside, Jacob was in his room, headphones on, typing at his computer, surrounded by open textbooks and a half-built model of a silver Mustang. The dog lifted its head from the couch when Laura came in, tail thumping once before curling back into sleep. The living room glowed softly with the yellow light from the standing lamp, the kind of light that made everything feel temporary, but safe. Laura hung her coat, kicked off her boots, and checked her phone. A missed call from her co-worker, another from her sister Denise, and one number she didn't recognize. She frowned but didn't call back. Later, when detectives examined her phone records, that number would lead them to a dead end. An unregistered prepaid phone, purchased at a convenience store off Route 94. At the time, no one could have known it belonged to the man who lived just 3 houses down, a man who had been studying her habits for months, learning the exact time her lights went out, the moments she stepped outside to smoke, the days she left early and came back late. Around 9, Jacob came downstairs, asking if they could order pizza. Laura smiled and said she'd rather cook something quick. They settled for soup and sandwiches, talking casually about his science project and her schedule for the next week. The conversation was light, but under the surface, Laura seemed distracted. She checked the window twice during dinner, her eyes flicking toward the driveway. When Jacob asked if something was wrong, she shook her head and smiled too quickly, telling him not to forget to feed the dog before bed. That nervous glance, that slight tightening in her voice, would later haunt investigators who replayed every detail of that night, wondering what she already knew. At 9:41 p.m., a neighbor named Alice Monroe was watching television when she heard a faint metallic sound coming from outside, something like a car door shutting, followed by muffled voices. She assumed it was Laura returning from work again, or perhaps greeting a visitor. She muted the television for a moment, listening. Nothing followed, only the steady rhythm of the wind scraping snow across the porch. A few houses away, another neighbor noticed lights flickering in the Brenner kitchen, then going dark. No one called the police. In a town like Haven Ridge, brief moments of noise or darkness were part of life, not signs of danger. The following timeline was reconstructed years later from phone data and forensic evidence. At 9:43 p.m., Laura received a text message. It read, "Need to fix that fuse box. Quick job. Can I stop by?" The number belonged to the same prepaid phone that had called her earlier. She didn't reply, but 2 minutes later, her security light outside the back door turned on, triggered by movement. The camera, which should have captured the image, had been disconnected days earlier. Police would find the cut wire during their initial sweep of the house. Whoever came that night knew where to disable it. At 9:47, Jacob's computer registered its final keystroke. The file saved automatically, an essay draft titled, "How Things Break." He had written 3 lines before stopping. Investigators later read them aloud in court. Sometimes things break slowly, before they fall apart all at once. You never know when it starts. At 9:50, the home phone line disconnected mid-call. The service log would later show an outgoing number, Denise's. She never picked up. From that moment on, there were no more signs of life in the Brenner house. The next piece of evidence was the idling car found later that night. Engine running, headlights still on, driver's door open, the seat adjusted far back, suggesting a taller person had been inside. The key was still in the ignition, Laura's purse missing, and the house left unlocked. On the kitchen counter, police would find 2 cups, one with lipstick on the rim, one untouched. Both tested for DNA years later. Only one matched Laura. The other, degraded but partially preserved, would one day match a name no one had suspected at the time. When officers first entered the home after the 911 call, they expected to find signs of a break-in, but instead, they found stillness. A home frozen in the moment just before disaster. There were no smashed windows, no blood visible, no clear struggle except for the splintered frame on the back door, as if someone had pushed too hard against it. The fingerprint lifted from that wood, blurred but distinct enough for partial ridge analysis, was logged into evidence and forgotten. One among hundreds of unsolved fragments collected in that first chaotic week. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering footprints and tire marks before dawn. The search began the next morning with local volunteers and state police. They combed through the surrounding woods, the frozen creek, the narrow road that led toward the old sawmill. Dogs were brought in, but lost the scent a few hundred yards from the house. Helicopters flew low over the icy fields, their spotlights sweeping in slow arcs. Nothing. No sign of Laura or Jacob, no personal items, not even a discarded glove. The only movement in those empty fields was the snow itself, reshaping the ground and burying what little truth it held. By the end of that first day, the tone of the investigation had shifted from hopeful to grim. Sergeant Ellison, standing beside the Brenner mailbox, told reporters that the evidence was inconclusive, a word that became shorthand for despair. The car was towed, the house sealed, and the neighborhood descended into quiet disbelief. For days afterward, residents drove past slowly, staring at the yellow tape flapping in the cold wind. The Brenner's dog was taken in by a neighbor, refusing food for nearly a week, often staring at the door as if waiting for someone to return. That night, as the police packed up their searchlights and left Birchwood Drive to the silence of falling snow, Haven Ridge changed forever. What had started as a small, manageable incident, a missed shift, a phone that wouldn't answer, had turned into a hole that nothing could fill. The house stood dark and empty, its porch light still blinking faintly in the cold, a cruel illusion of life. And from that night on, no one saw Laura or Jacob Brenner again. In the days that followed the disappearance, the investigation expanded from a local search into a statewide effort. The Haven Ridge Police Department, unequipped for a case of this magnitude, requested assistance from the Michigan State Police and the FBI's Missing Persons Unit. What had begun as a welfare check now carried the weight of a presumed abduction, though no ransom call ever came, no sign of negotiation, no voice on the other end of a line asking for anything at all. That silence disturbed investigators most of all. Detective Mark Ellison, who had led the first response, was placed in charge of coordination. He was a man with 20 years in homicide, known for patience rather than brilliance, a quiet, methodical thinker whose notepad was always half full of questions rather than conclusions. He had seen domestic disputes spiral into tragedy and had seen accidents mistaken for crimes. But this case defied both patterns. There was no chaos, no disorderly violence, only precision. The calm removal of 2 lives from the fabric of an ordinary street. The first step was reconstruction. Investigators began charting the Brenners' final 24 hours, tracing phone calls, work schedules, and vehicle movements. Surveillance cameras from gas stations along the highway showed nothing unusual. The last confirmed sighting of Laura was a co-worker waving to her in the hospital parking lot at 7:12 p.m. She had appeared calm, carrying her usual thermos and medical bag. After that, the timeline dissolved into speculation. Forensics teams swept the house repeatedly, focusing on the back door, where the broken frame and the partial fingerprint were found. They lifted the print carefully using a gel film, photographed it under UV light, and ran it through the automated fingerprint identification system. The result came back inconclusive, too partial to match any existing records. The print was cataloged as Evidence Butor 14 BD03 and stored, waiting for a technology that didn't yet exist to make it speak. Inside the kitchen, luminol testing revealed faint traces of biological residue on the tile floor near the threshold, but the chemical reaction was too weak to classify as blood. It was recorded, then dismissed as an artifact from cleaning agents. The detectives interviewed every neighbor on Birchwood Drive, moving from house to house as snow fell again, muffling the street in deceptive calm. Most residents repeated the same story. They had heard nothing, seen nothing, believed nothing dangerous could happen here. Only one man, a retired postal worker named Harris, reported seeing a figure walking away from the Brenner house around 10 that night. Tall, heavy coat, maybe a hat, he said, squinting at the memory. Could have been anybody. His testimony joined the growing pile of ambiguous notes that led nowhere. As the first week stretched into the second, the case began to consume Ellison's life. He spent long nights in the converted office above the town library, staring at a wall covered in photographs, maps, and notes strung together with red thread. The photographs of Laura and Jacob, smiling at a summer picnic, seemed almost accusatory in their brightness. Ellison often found himself talking to them under his breath, promising that he would not let them fade into another unsolved folder. The pressure from media added to the strain. Reporters from Detroit and Chicago descended on Haven Ridge, broadcasting from the end of Birchwood Drive with headlines like The Vanishing Family and Frozen Secrets of Michigan. The cameras caught Ellison's weary expression and the stoic faces of volunteers trudging through the snow with flashlights, the images turning the Brenner case into a symbol of modern suburban fear. By late February, the search had expanded to nearby lakes. Divers in insulated suits plunged into the icy water at Silver Pond, guided by sonar readings that suggested large submerged objects. Each time they surfaced, shaking their heads, the air filled with a kind of exhausted resignation. Helicopters combed the frozen forests, heat sensors scanning for any trace of life. but the only signals they detected were deer and stray dogs. The local church opened its basement for volunteers, who organized meal deliveries for the search teams. Laura's sister Denise stood at the front every morning, clutching a photo of her sister and nephew, her eyes hollow but determined. "Bring them home," she whispered each time, a phrase that soon appeared on posters across the county. Detective Ellison's instincts kept returning to one possibility. The act wasn't random. He studied Laura's phone records again, noticing the unregistered number that had called her twice before she vanished. Tracing it led to nothing. The prepaid SIM card had been purchased with cash, activated for only 4 days, and then disconnected. He made a note beside it. Professional? Or someone careful? In the margins, he scribbled a second line. Could be someone she knew. The handwriting grew darker, as if pressed harder into the paper, an unconscious reflection of his frustration. In March, a new lead surfaced when an abandoned cabin was found on the outskirts of the state forest, about 12 miles from Haven Ridge. Inside were old tools, a generator, and a stained blanket that seemed out of place among the dust. The cabin's owner had died years earlier, leaving it unused, but footprints around the property were recent. Forensic teams swabbed every surface, though the snowmelt had already washed away most traces. A few fibers matched the same polyester blend found in Laura's work uniform, but the connection was weak. Dozens of similar fabrics existed. Still, Ellison clung to it as a potential sign that the Brenners had been there. Weeks later, lab results dismissed the match as coincidental. The disappointment was crushing. As spring approached, the investigation slowed. Theories divided the department. Some believed the Brenners had been abducted by a stranger passing through, perhaps a trucker or a drifter. Others leaned toward domestic involvement, though no family members had motives or criminal history. Ellison believed neither. He returned repeatedly to the image of the untouched coffee cup and the fingerprint on the door. Whoever entered that house, he thought, had been invited, or at least familiar enough not to raise alarm. His colleagues called it intuition. To Ellison, it was something heavier, a sense of presence that lingered, as if the perpetrator still lived among them. By the end of the first year, resources began to thin. The media moved on, the volunteers returned to their lives, and the bright posters faded under rain and sunlight. The Brenner file thickened, but offered no answers. Each page felt like another stone in a growing grave of paperwork. Ellison refused to close it, but the department shifted priorities to newer cases. When he was finally reassigned, he packed the Brenner documents himself, labeling the box with neat handwriting. Active, unresolved. He placed it on a shelf in the evidence room and stood there for several minutes before walking away. Later that night, in his personal notebook, he wrote a single line before turning off the light. Someone close did this. We just haven't learned how close yet. That quiet conviction would become the thread that future investigators followed when technology caught up to the evidence he had left behind. The fingerprint on the door, forgotten and smudged, waited silently in a sealed envelope. For 15 years, it sat in darkness, enduring floods, reorganizations, and the slow decay of files, until one day, a young detective in a different decade would unseal it and see what Ellison always suspected, that the killer had never left Birchwood Drive. By the summer of 2010, Haven Ridge was no longer the quiet, self-contained community it once had been. What began as a local tragedy had transformed into a spectacle that drew cameras, satellite vans, and strangers with notebooks. Reporters prowled the tree-lined streets, their boots crunching over gravel as they rehearsed somber introductions about a mystery that refuses to melt away with the snow. The disappearance of Laura and Jacob Brenner had evolved into something larger than the town itself. an emblem of suburban fragility that fascinated audiences across the Midwest. The sight of the Blue House on Birchwood Drive became an image broadcast nightly on television, its blinds drawn, its porch light unlit. For the residents who had once waved to Laura while she watered her flowers, it was a wound that refused to close, reopened each evening by the flicker of a news report. Media pressure was relentless. Talk shows debated theories with the confidence of experts who had never set foot in Haven Ridge. Some speculated about abduction rings. Others insisted it was a lover's quarrel gone wrong, while the most cynical commentators accused the police of incompetence. Theories spread like wildfire through message boards and early social media, where self-proclaimed detectives pored over grainy photos of the Brenner home and analyzed the shape of footprints in the snow as though truth could be extracted from pixels. For the investigators still clinging to the case, this noise was both fuel and poison. Fuel because it kept the story alive. Poison because it buried the facts under endless speculation. Detective Ellison grew visibly older during those months. His voice, once measured, became taut in interviews as he repeated that the department was pursuing every lead. He disliked the way reporters spoke of the Brenners as if they were already dead. To him, the case remained open, not because he was optimistic, but because accepting closure without proof felt like surrender. Yet the pressure to produce results increased. The mayor called for updates every week, and the governor's office requested reports that could be quoted in statements meant to reassure voters that Michigan's law enforcement was both modern and relentless. Behind closed doors, Ellison's small team sat in the stuffy office over the library, sifting through the same stack of reports they had read 100 times, searching for something they might have missed. As months passed, the attention began to warp the town itself. Birchwood Drive became a pilgrimage site for curiosity seekers. Cars slowed to a crawl as visitors snapped photos from rolled-down windows. Someone left a bouquet of roses on the Brenner's porch, and the next morning, a teenager stole them, later bragging online about owning a souvenir from the ghost house. The quiet street where children once rode bikes now carried an undertone of dread. Parents forbade their kids to walk alone. Porch lights stayed on all night, but no one lingered outside. Haven Ridge, in trying to protect itself, had become a portrait of suspicion. Within the police department, frustration curdled into resignation. Budgets tightened, search teams dwindled, and eventually the investigation lost its daily urgency. The case file, once occupying a full desk, was condensed into a single archive box, marked Active, Pending. When reporters asked if there were new developments, the answers became mechanical. The headlines shifted from Search Intensifies to No Leads After 6 months, then finally to Family Feared Dead. For the first time, the idea of the Brenners being gone forever entered public vocabulary, and with it came a quiet acceptance that the story might never reach its end. But for Laura's sister Denise, the media storm became her only tool for survival. Each time the story began to fade, she reached out to journalists, reminding them of anniversaries, organizing vigils, handing out candles and flyers. Her grief transformed into activism, and in that transformation, she became the face of endurance for every family that had ever waited by a silent phone. The local press adored her resilience. The national ones exploited it. When she stood in front of the Brenner house one winter evening, speaking into microphones about hope and justice, her breath visible in the freezing air, it was broadcast live on 2 networks. Viewers across the country saw a woman refusing to let her loved ones vanish into statistics. Behind her, the Blue House loomed like a tombstone in the snow, its windows dark, its secrets sealed beneath layers of silence and frost. By early 2011, When reporters finally began to pack up and leave, Haven Ridge felt both relieved and exposed, as though it had been stripped of something private. The Brenner story, once an intimate tragedy, had become public property, dissected and dramatized until it lost its human shape. Yet beneath the fading headlines, one truth remained constant. The case was no closer to resolution than it had been on the night Laura and Jacob disappeared. The police files were thicker, the evidence unchanged, and the single fingerprint, fragile, blurred, and half-forgotten, waited quietly in its envelope, untouched by all the noise outside. The cameras would move on, but that print would remain, a silent witness stored in darkness, outlasting the frenzy, the grief, and the passing of years. It was still there, patient and immutable, holding the only voice that could one day speak for the Brenners when the world had stopped listening. The years that followed the disappearance of Laura and Jacob Brenner settled over Haven Ridge like a slow snowfall, quiet and suffocating. By 2012, the story that had once filled every television broadcast had faded into the background hum of unresolved tragedies. The posters on telephone poles had long been torn by weather or replaced by lost pet notices. The blue house on Birchwood Drive was sold at auction, its new owners repainting the exterior a pale gray, as if color alone could erase memory. Yet those who had lived through that winter never forgot. The house carried a gravity that made people glance away as they passed. Some said they still saw lights flicker in its windows late at night, though the electricity had been cut off for years. Others simply avoided the street altogether, unwilling to acknowledge the void that sat quietly among them. For law enforcement, the Brenner case drifted into that bureaucratic limbo known as inactive pending review. Detective Mark Ellison retired in 2013, his final report written in the careful, detached language of someone who had learned to let unanswered questions harden into routine. No additional leads developed, it read. Case remains open. But in the margins of his private notebook, which his daughter found years later, he had written a single sentence. The killer still lives close. That thought lingered like a ghost in the department. Even after his retirement, new recruits were told about the Brenner case as a kind of cautionary legend, a reminder that evil could hide beneath porch lights and polite greetings. For Laura's sister Denise, the passing years did not dull the ache. It only refined it into ritual. Every February, she drove to Haven Ridge and placed 2 candles at the edge of the old property line, one for her sister, one for her nephew. She never spoke while she stood there. She said she preferred the silence because it made her feel as if they might still be listening. In 2016, she contacted the Michigan Cold Case Task Force, asking if new technology might re-examine the evidence. A polite response came weeks later. Resources currently limited. Case under review. It was a phrase that meant nothing, but still gave her a sliver of hope. She taped the letter to her refrigerator, next to a fading photo of Laura smiling in the sun, hair windblown, eyes bright. As the decade wore on, Haven Ridge changed in ways that made the tragedy seem even more distant. New families moved in, unaware of the shadows beneath the snow-covered lawns. The grocery store was remodeled, the diner closed, and the post office painted over the old bulletin board that had once displayed the Brenners' missing posters. Life returned in appearance, but beneath it ran an unspoken current of guilt, a collective memory that refused to be buried. For those who had been there, time did not heal. It only layered silence over the wound. Then, in 2020, the Michigan Cold Case Unit began digitizing decades of forensic evidence. The Brenner files, thick with paper reports and aging photographs, were transferred into a database. The fingerprint, still sealed in its envelope, was scanned and logged, though no one yet ran it through the updated national system. It sat in digital storage as it had once sat in physical storage, waiting, dormant, inert. Forensic technicians noted the poor quality and partial ridges, categorizing it as unsuitable for active comparison. The report was uploaded, time-stamped, and forgotten once again. But technology, like truth, has its own sense of timing. That same year, Denise was interviewed for a local podcast on unsolved crimes. Her voice, steadier than before, but tinged with exhaustion, carried through headphones and speakers across the state. She spoke not of vengeance, but of clarity. "I don't need to know why anymore," she said softly. "I just need to know where." The episode gained quiet attention online, reigniting small conversations about the case. Listeners began sharing the old photographs, the house, the street, the smiling mother, and her son frozen in time. Among those who listened was a young detective named Samantha Cole, recently assigned to the state's Forensic Reexamination Division. She was only 16 when the Brenners disappeared, old enough to remember the news footage, young enough to have believed such things couldn't happen in places like hers. Hearing Denise's voice again, she reopened the digital file out of curiosity, scrolling through Ellison's notes and the photograph of the fingerprint on the doorframe. It was the kind of detail most people would have overlooked, smudged, faint, ordinary. But Cole paused, thinking of the new analytical systems that had come online that year, algorithms capable of reconstructing partial ridge patterns with unprecedented accuracy. She marked the case for review, intending to run it through the new AFIS upgrade once the backlog cleared. Weeks passed. The request was delayed by administrative shuffle. Then, one evening in 2124, while cross-referencing old evidence, she noticed the Brenner file again and submitted the fingerprint sample through the system manually. The computer hummed for several minutes before producing a low-confidence match. A man named Russell Kane, age 58, last known address, Birchwood Drive. The name meant nothing to her at first, just another line on a screen. But when she pulled the historical property records and saw that the address listed was 3 houses down from the Brenners, something cold settled in her chest. That night, as snow began to fall again across Michigan, she reopened the archived photographs of Birchwood Drive taken 15 years earlier. The blue house was gone, repainted, re-owned, and reimagined. But the street was the same, the map unchanged. Somewhere within those quiet houses lived the truth that had eluded everyone for more than a decade. The case that the town had buried, that the state had cataloged and forgotten, was breathing again through a single digital spark, and as Detective Cole leaned back in her chair, the glow of the monitor lighting her face, she whispered to herself the words Ellison had once written in his notebook, though she had never seen them. The killer still lives close. When Detective Samantha Cole reopened the Brenner file in January of 2025, the world outside Haven Ridge had changed, but the landscape inside those folders remained frozen in time. The scanned photographs of the Brenner home still showed the same cold geometry of tragedy. The idling car, the splintered doorframe, the coffee mugs on the counter. Even in grayscale, they carried the strange intimacy of objects abandoned midlife. Cole was meticulous by nature, a product of a generation raised on digital precision, and she approached old evidence with the patience of someone decoding a forgotten language. Her desk was cluttered with case files from across the state, but the Brenner file held a peculiar gravity. Perhaps it was the symmetry of the story. A mother, a child, a quiet town, and the unbearable silence that followed. Perhaps it was something else, something that stirred in her when she saw the words, partial fingerprint, no match. She had been 16 when the case first broke, and she remembered sitting in her parents' living room watching the news footage of the snow-covered house, her mother turning off the television because it was too sad for dinner. Now, as she scrolled through the same images in high resolution, she understood that sadness had only deepened, calcified into a question left unanswered for 15 years. Cole had joined the Michigan Cold Case Unit because she believed evidence didn't expire. It simply waited for someone to listen differently. She requested the original fingerprint scan from the state archive, not expecting much. The note attached read, "Low quality, partial ridge structure, previously inconclusive." But the new automated fingerprint identification system, upgraded the previous year, could reconstruct missing patterns through AI-enhanced comparison, detecting ridge points invisible to the naked eye. She loaded the image into the database, adjusted the contrast manually, and clicked Submit. The system processed for 27 minutes. Most of that time, she watched the progress bar move slowly, each percent a pulse in the quiet office. When the notification finally appeared, "Possible match found," she leaned forward, heart steady but alert. The name that appeared was ordinary, almost disappointingly so. Russell Kane, male, 59, no criminal record, resident of Haven Ridge. The initial match score was low, only 63%, but Cole requested a manual review. The system confirmed 12 consistent ridge points, one more than the threshold for probable identification. She opened the file on Kane and discovered that he had lived on Birchwood Drive since 1996 at number 42, 3 houses down from the Brenners. He had reported the night of their disappearance as uneventful in his original statement, and had even volunteered briefly in the early search efforts. His background was unremarkable. Retired electrician, widowed, no arrests, no debt, a man who had mowed his lawn every Saturday and fixed neighbors' lights for free. He was, in every visible way, the archetype of small-town reliability. And yet, the fingerprint on the Brenner's broken doorframe was his. Cole knew better than to move too quickly. False matches had ruined careers. She requested access to the physical evidence for re-verification and drove to the state archive outside Lansing, where thousands of sealed boxes rested under humming fluorescent lights. She signed out the Brenner evidence box, its label faded but legible, and sat at the sterile examination table while the technician unsealed it. Inside were the preserved swabs, photographs, and one clear envelope marked 14BD03. The fingerprint sample, though degraded, was intact. Under magnification, the ridges curved in a pattern unmistakably human, but faint, fragile as memory. She compared it to a fresh print obtained from Kane's employment records at the county utility office. The overlay matched perfectly at 13 distinct points. Statistically, the probability of coincidence was less than 1 in 10 billion. She called her superior that afternoon. The response was cautious, but immediate. Within 24 hours, a small task force was formed to re-examine Kane quietly. They combed through his property history, his financial records, his social connections. It was a portrait of stability bordering on invisibility. He had retired in 2018 after a mild back injury, rarely traveled, and spent most days repairing old radios in his garage. There were no obvious motives, no debt, no known conflict with the Brenners, no history of violence. Yet his proximity and the evidence linking him to the back door reframed everything. Cole drove to Haven Ridge herself on a gray January morning, the kind of cold that seems to erase sound. She parked at the corner of Birchwood Drive and sat for a long time, watching the street. The houses looked smaller than in the old photos, as if time had made them retreat inward. Children played in yards where search teams had once trudged through snow. The Brenner house, repainted in pale gray, looked almost indifferent to its own past. 3 doors down, number 42 stood exactly as it had been. A tidy single-story home with a shingled roof and a flag mounted near the porch. The only sound came from a wind chime that tinkled faintly in the icy air. When Cole finally knocked on Kane's door, he opened it almost immediately, as if expecting her. He was tall, white-haired, with the kind of calm that comes from decades of routine. His eyes, pale blue, seemed both kind and distant. She introduced herself, explained that she was following up on an old neighborhood case, and asked if he remembered the Brenners. He nodded slowly, his expression neither guarded nor open. "Terrible thing," he said softly. "She was a nice woman, kept to herself mostly." He invited her inside for coffee. She declined but asked if she could see his garage, claiming she was reviewing old volunteer reports. Without hesitation, he led her through the kitchen to the back. The space was immaculate. Tools hung on the walls in precise alignment, boxes labeled neatly, the concrete floor swept clean. Yet one cabinet in the corner caught her eye, a heavy metal storage unit with a new padlock that didn't match the age of the rest of the room. When she asked about it, he smiled faintly. "Old electrical stuff. Dangerous? I keep it locked up." She made a note but didn't press further. After leaving, Cole sat in her car, pulse steady but mind racing. Everything about the man felt rehearsed, the measured voice, the politeness, the perfectly timed pauses. It was as if he had spent years preparing for this conversation. Back in Lansing, she filed her preliminary report, citing probable cause for a property search. The warrant was approved within 48 hours. When they returned to Kane's home 2 days later, accompanied by a forensics team, he was still there, calm as before, sipping tea at the kitchen table. He didn't protest, only watched as they opened the locked cabinet. Inside were coiled extension cords, an assortment of tools, a weathered flashlight, and at the very bottom, a small wooden box containing a tarnished locket engraved with the initials LB. Inside the locket was a faded photograph of a boy and a golden retriever. Forensic testing later confirmed the presence of Laura Brenner's DNA on the clasp. It was not yet a confession, not even definitive proof of murder, but it was the first time in 15 years that the case had spoken. Cole looked at Kane as the evidence was catalogued, waiting for a reaction. He offered none, only a faint smile that seemed to acknowledge something inevitable. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering snow across the drive. And as the officers led him away for questioning, Cole glanced back at the quiet street, at the rows of houses that had watched 15 winters pass without knowing they were living beside the answer. For the first time since 2010, Birchwood Drive was awake. Russell Kane sat in the gray interrogation room of the Kent County Sheriff's Office, his hands folded neatly on the table, as if he were waiting for a meeting rather than facing the consequences of 15 years of buried silence. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above, their steady buzz filling the pauses between questions. Detective Samantha Cole watched him carefully, trying to reconcile the calmness of the man before her with the image of the crime scene that had haunted the file for over a decade. She had spent months studying every trace of his life, every receipt, every maintenance record, every tax document. There was nothing outwardly suspicious. Yet the fingerprint, the locket, and the precise proximity of his home to the Brenners created a picture that could no longer be ignored. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, carrying the steady tone of someone accustomed to being listened to. "I already told the police everything back then," he said. "I didn't know her well. I helped fix her light once, maybe twice. That's it." Cole nodded, allowing silence to stretch before she replied. Then how do you explain your fingerprint on her back door? He didn't look away. If it's there, it must be from when I fixed the light. She thanked me with coffee. Nice woman. For a long time, that was all he said. He answered each question with the precision of someone who had rehearsed a story so many times it had become muscle memory. But Cole understood patterns, the way truth always faltered under repetition. She asked about his employment records, his days leading up to February 6th, 2010, and the repairs he had supposedly done for the Brenners. Slowly, cracks began to appear. He couldn't recall the exact date. He contradicted himself about the payment. He referred to Jacob in the past tense before being reminded that, officially, the boy was still listed as missing. Each small inconsistency pulled another thread loose, revealing a man less composed than he appeared. Outside the observation window, senior detectives and a prosecutor watched in silence. They had seen hundreds of interrogations, but there was something unsettling about Kane's demeanor. He wasn't defensive or frightened. He was detached, as if the events in question belonged to someone else entirely. When Cole placed the locket on the table, sealed in a clear evidence bag, he glanced at it only once, his eyes flickering before he looked down. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but enough to register as recognition. "Where did you find that?" he asked. "In your locked cabinet," Cole replied. "It belonged to Laura Brenner. It has her DNA on it." He inhaled slowly, exhaled, then said, "People leave things behind. I collect old junk." His voice trembled slightly, the first break in the otherwise smooth surface. Hours passed. The room seemed to shrink around them. Cole shifted strategies, abandoning direct accusation for a quieter tone. She spoke about Laura as a person, her job at the hospital, her son's interest in electronics, the house that smelled of cinnamon candles. She described the cold February night, the idling car, the lights left on. Her words carried no judgment, only observation. Gradually, Kane's posture changed. His shoulders sagged, his hands unclasped. "She shouldn't have come to the door," he murmured once, almost too quietly to hear. Cole stayed still. "Why shouldn't she?" she asked. His reply came after a long silence. "Because she knew something she wasn't supposed to know." It was the first statement that didn't fit the pattern of denial. Cole leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "What did she know, Russell?" He stared at the table, his thumb tracing invisible lines on the smooth surface. "She found out I'd been billing people for repairs I never did," he said eventually. "Small things. A few hundred here, a few hundred there. I didn't think it mattered. She said she was going to tell the township." His tone hardened. "She made me feel small, like I was a criminal over nothing." The confession emerged in fragments at first, half-whispered admissions wrapped in self-justification. She was angry. We argued. I told her to calm down. She tried to leave. I grabbed her arm. She slipped. He paused then, staring at the wall as if seeing that night unfold again. "The boy came running in. He hit me. I didn't mean to." His voice caught, and for a moment his composure cracked entirely. "They both fell," he finished softly, the words collapsing into the silence that followed. Outside the room, the observers exchanged looks. The statement was neither full confession nor complete denial, but it was enough to move the case into the realm of murder. Forensics would later confirm that ground-penetrating radar scans of Kane's garage floor detected irregularities consistent with disturbed soil beneath a newer layer of concrete. A warrant was issued that evening. The excavation began at dawn, the air bitter and metallic with winter cold. Reporters gathered as news spread that authorities were digging under a suburban garage in connection with the Brenner case. The sight was surreal. Floodlights cutting through mist, the rhythmic scraping of shovels against cement, the collective breath of a town that had forgotten how to exhale. By mid-morning, a patch of concrete was removed, revealing dark, compacted earth. The technicians worked slowly, methodically. When the first bone fragment appeared, the air around the site shifted. Conversations stopped. Within hours, 2 sets of remains were recovered, one adult, one adolescent, carefully wrapped in remnants of fabric. Dental records confirmed the identities: Laura and Jacob Brenner. The discovery, 15 years after their disappearance, unfolded with the quiet inevitability of truth finally allowed to surface. The news spread across the state, each headline echoing the same stunned relief: Brenner family found. Kane was charged that afternoon. When the deputies came for him, he offered no resistance. He stood, nodded, and said only, "I knew this day would come." The calm returned to his face, the same practiced composure that had carried him through years of pretense. In court, when the charges were read, 2 counts of murder in the first degree, he stared straight ahead, unmoved, while Denise Brenner sat in the front row, clutching a photo of her sister. His attorney entered a plea of guilty to avoid trial, stating that his client wished to bring peace to the family. There was no peace in the room, only the heavy stillness that comes when an old wound is reopened in the light. As Detective Cole left the courthouse that evening, snow began to fall, soft and slow, settling on the roofs of Haven Ridge like a final benediction. The lights of Birchwood Drive glowed in the distance, the street unchanged, but no longer innocent. The truth, once hidden beneath layers of cement and silence, had finally spoken. And yet, as Cole drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the quietest crimes were never entirely solved. They merely stopped echoing loud enough for others to hear. The trial of Russell Kane concluded in May of 2025, 15 years and 3 months after the night Laura and Jacob Brenner disappeared. The courtroom in Grand Rapids was small, its walls lined with framed portraits of judges long gone, their painted eyes bearing witness to the fragile balance between justice and memory. The air smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant, and each creak of the benches seemed to echo with the weight of the years that had passed. Kane sat expressionless as the judge read the sentence: 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He didn't look toward the gallery where Denise Brenner sat with folded hands and tired eyes. She watched him as one might watch the closing of a door, not with triumph, but with an exhausted kind of mercy. When the gavel fell, it was not applause or tears that followed, but silence, a deep and trembling quiet that filled the space like fog after a storm. Outside the courthouse, the day was unusually bright for early spring. Reporters gathered on the steps, their cameras blinking, but the story they captured was no longer about mystery or speculation. It was about endurance, the long, invisible work of time and persistence. Denise spoke briefly, her voice clear but fragile, thanking the investigators who had refused to forget. "For 15 years, I woke up every morning wondering if anyone still cared," she said. "Now I know that someone did." She didn't mention Kane by name. She didn't have to. His existence would remain only as the answer to a question that had stolen half her life. Detective Samantha Cole stood nearby, hands in her coat pockets, watching the crowd disperse. The case had changed her in ways she hadn't expected. She had joined the cold case unit believing in logic, in evidence, and persistence. But what the Brenner file had taught her was something quieter. That truth isn't found in the noise of headlines or the precision of data, but in patience, in the endurance of those who keep asking the same question long after the world has stopped listening. As she drove out of Haven Ridge later that week, she passed Birchwood Drive one final time. The street looked peaceful, lined with trimmed hedges and mailboxes dusted with pollen instead of snow. Children rode bicycles near the corner where police cars had once parked. The Brenner house stood silent, its paint already fading, its windows reflecting only the soft gray of the sky. Life had returned, indifferent and unknowing. Denise returned there in June, leaving flowers by the driveway, 2 white lilies tied with a ribbon. She didn't stay long. The air was warm, and the sound of wind through the oak leaves reminded her faintly of laughter. She whispered something no one heard and turned away, walking slowly back to her car. Behind her, the town carried on, unaware that in the smallest act, a fingerprint left in haste, a sister's persistence, a detective's curiosity, the silence that had held Haven Ridge for 15 winters had finally been broken. The story of Laura and Jacob Brenner ended not with spectacle, but with a quiet truth, that justice, when it comes, rarely erases the pain, but it restores balance to the world it once fractured. In the end, all that remained were the faint traces of their lives, photographs, a locket, the memory of a warm house on a cold night, and the reminder that even in places where time seems to stand still, truth is patient. It waits. And when the moment comes, it speaks.